Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and it's once again spooky season, which means I get to make another scary pumpkin. For years, I used to sculpt and carve real pumpkins, but I hated the fact that I'd spend hours working on them just to throw them away in a couple of weeks. Over the past couple of years, I've switched over to foam carvable pumpkins, and I love this idea because I get to use them year after year. In fact, last year I made a mimic pumpkin, and if you would like to see this video, it's on my channel. I'll go ahead and link it up above in case you would like to make your own. This year, I decided to do one a little more traditional, but still super scary. Now, this is one of the foam carvable pumpkins you can pick up at most craft and hardware stores, and I also utilized some of my HD foam and foam clay to give it a super scary look. In fact, in this video, I'm going to be focusing on these really cool monster eyes, these wicked looking teeth, and of course, an amazing paint job. So, I want to show you what it takes to put together your own super scary pumpkin. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start by making our monster eyes by using some clear Christmas bulbs. 10mm foam was cut into a 3-inch circle which will fit the interior diameter. Foam clay is going to be used to build up the details on the eye. Then I can take a wooden dowel to mark the location of the pupil. Using this as a reference, I wet the surface of the foam, which is going to help make the foam clay adhere. The clay is then pressed all around the perimeter of the eye, trying to build up as much material as possible. To give the iris some texture, some crumpled up foil is pressed into the surface. Then by using a variety of silicone tip tools, I can sculpt the clay. Midway through, I wet the foam dowel, that way I can once again redefine the pupil. To finish it off, I use a small metal pick and some more foil to give the iris a decent amount of texture. While I allow the foam clay to dry, I can sketch out the face of my pumpkin on the surface with a pencil. To carve my pumpkin, I'm going to be using a scalpel blade on my heat tool, which is going to release some fumes, so I definitely recommend to wear a respirator and work in a well-ventilated area. If you didn't want to go through all this trouble, you could use the hobby blade on its own, but adding the heat makes a huge difference in how well it cuts through the surface. After being cut, the eye material can be removed, and you can see just how clean these cuts are. This same cutting process is also applied to the nose and the mouth. And the cool thing is, even if you weren't going to add all the additional details that I'm going to, this is a really fun way to make a pumpkin that's going to last year after year. With my eyes, nose, and mouth all cut out, I'm now going to cut a section out of the back. This will eventually be glued back into place, but it's going to give me an opening that's going to make it a lot easier to attach things on the inside. After 24 hours, my foam clay is skinned over and started to dry, so I can use a wire brush to add even more details to the iris. And now's a good time to do a test fit just to see how it's going to look inside of the bulb. To paint my eyes, I start by sealing them with a layer of Plasti-Dip and red oxide primer. From there, I'll use some Liquitex heavy body cadmium-free orange over the entire surface. As a wash for the eyes, I'm going to use some watered down red oxide. To define the outside of the eyes, some Liquitex cadmium red is dry brushed across the surface. This same process is repeated on the inside of the eye using some more cadmium orange. Liquitex heavy-bodied cadmium yellow is now dry brushed over the innermost area. And as a final highlight, some Liquitex parchment is added to the cadmium yellow. All these layers go together well to make an interesting look that's a lot better than just a single flat color. I'm going to use some Liquitex Mars Black to paint in the pupils on these eyes. Another test fit, and you can see how this process works great for this pumpkin, but it could also be fantastic for a lot of other cosplay or craft creatures. To give the face of this pumpkin some more dimension, I cut across the brow with a hobby knife. This is then glued on top of the nasal section using some Bob Smith super glue. 10mm foam is going to be used to build up the gums for my pumpkin. This is first traced to see how much material I'm going to need, and then I add a little bit more and that's going to be glued to the inside of the pumpkin. Super glue is all I'm going to use because it's not a heavy wear area, but you could also use contact cement. And even though I've glued these gums in, I'm going to refine them even more throughout the build process. Additional 10mm foam is also going to be cut for his eyes, making sure to remove enough material in the middle so that our monster eyes fit properly. And to give it some character, notice that the material surrounding the eyes is a little bit different on either side. Additional 10mm foam is also glued in behind the nose. Now seeing it all together, I think my eyes are a little too big, so I'm going to cut them down to a smaller diameter. This is going to allow them to be closer up with a smaller cornea. And that's the great thing about foam, is that you can easily change your ideas as you're building. All of the foam now needs to be rounded over using a smooth sanding drum on my Dremel rotary tool. This is going to help make the foam look a lot more organic, but I'm also going to remove some foam on the backside so that the eyes fit into the material better. As a mock-up, that's starting to look pretty cool. Now because more of the eye is shown, I'm going to paint the inside of these bulbs using some Liquitex Mars Black. Once the paint is dried, I can use some super glue to glue the eyes in on either side. To fabricate the teeth, I'm going to be using some 20mm HD foam round dowels. I did one as a proof of concept just to make sure I was happy with how it was going to look. Then I could cut a bunch of cylinders in various shapes and sizes. All the teeth can now be refined using that smooth sanding drum on my rotary tool. And after a light heat treat with the heat gun, these teeth are ready to be glued into place. At this point, looking at it, I wanted to reshape the gums, so I cut them down with my knife and sanded them once again with my rotary tool. With the gums good to go, I can now glue on all of the teeth, starting with the largest ones and moving to the smallest ones. Using my heat gun for a little heat treat, and this mouth is looking wicked. Using my heat tool once again, but this time with a different tip, I'm going to burn out the nostril section. Notice that a lot of fumes come off of this, so be sure to wear your respirator. To bulk up the majority of the details for this face, I'm going to be using foam clay. It's great for organic work, and once the moisture wicks out and becomes completely dry, it's rock hard. If you've never used foam clay before, it's really easy to work with. You want to wet the surface and then press the material onto it. The way I like to work is I apply most of this with my fingers, and then when I need specific details, I'll switch over to silicone tip tools. But as you can see, it's easy to apply, and once it's built up, you can sculpt in your desired shapes. Now the thing that's fun about this process is normally when I'm making props, I have to replicate something as close as I can. But this gives me the opportunity to sculpt purely using my imagination, so definitely use your creative abilities on yours. Now notice while I'm working, I'm moving down the face of the pumpkin, and that's because until the foam clay dries, it can be distorted quite easily. So I'm always moving from one area to the next, so I'm not messing up sections that I've already finished. I want the eyes to be a focal point, so I add even more foam clay around them just to give them some additional character. The stem on this foam pumpkin is quite lacking, so I'm going to add my own. And I'm going to do that by first making a base structure using some 18 gauge wire. The wire is first twisted to give it some additional reinforcement, and then I can drill a small pilot hole in the top of the stem. After the wire had been pressed in and glued into place, this will be plenty sturdy for some additional foam clay. But I don't want to use just foam clay because it's a waste of materials and it'll take too long to dry. So I bulk out the shape of my stem in tinfoil first. Then I'm able to skin it with the foam clay and still sculpt in all my details. Once I'm done sculpting, the foam clay needs to dry for 24 hours. This will allow the material to skin over and be ready for paint. After 24 hours, the pumpkin's looking good and I'm really happy with the stem. Since I no longer need to access the interior, I can glue the back panel in place. To protect the eyes during the initial painting process, I'm going to cover both of them with some blue masking tape. I'm going to be using Plasti-Dip to seal my foam and my foam clay, but you could also use products like FlexBond. Once the Plasti-Dip had been allowed to cure, it's time to spray on my base colors. And for that I'm going to use Krylon Red Oxide Primer and a Valspar Orange Satin. These are just going to be dusted onto the surface, giving a decent base to hand paint some acrylics. To start off, I'm going to dry brush the highlighted areas using some Liquitex Cadmium Orange. Now when I say dry brush, I'm using a 1-inch mop brush, but absolutely no water. This is going to allow the paint to hit all those highlights that I had sculpted in. Purple and orange always look great together. So for the skin around the eyes and the gums, I'm going to be using Liquitex Dioxazine Purple. Now this paint is watered down a little bit because I want those primer colors that I laid down to show through here and there. Using that same color, but this time no water, I'm going to use a filbert brush and dry brush down into the shadowed areas. These areas will include his brows, his nostril, and of course the base of the stem. With the majority of the painting complete, I can now remove the blue tape. And you can see how those eyes make a huge difference with those new colors applied. Using a detail brush, I apply more of the purple to areas where the blue tape was covering the foam. I decided instead of using a brown for the stem that the purple would look great here as well. Now it's time to paint the teeth, and I'm going to use a very watered down version of Liquitex Heavy Body Raw Sienna. This will be applied with a filbert brush, making sure to get that distinction between the teeth and the gums. As a highlight for the tips of the teeth, I'm going to be mixing together some cadmium-free yellow and parchment along with the raw sienna. This is going to be dry brushed at the tip of each tooth, and then I work my way up to the gum. For a super slick, glossy, nasty look, one of my favorite tricks is using some 5-minute epoxy. This will be applied to the mouth, the nose, and the skin around the eyes. After the epoxy has been thoroughly mixed together, it's applied with a chip brush directly to the prop. After the epoxy dries, it'll keep this glossy look, but you definitely want to make sure not to get it on the plastic for the eyes. As a final touch, I'm going to add some straw into the mouth. It's just one of those little details that helps bring a prop to life. So you all can see the steps that I took to put together my own super scary pumpkin for this year, and hopefully this inspires you to do the same. The thing that's great about this is because you're not having to match something 100%, you get to use your own creativity to make your individual pumpkin. And if you are building any of my builds or utilizing some HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. I've started doing Maker Mondays once again on my Instagram, and I just might feature your work. So until next time, build your best with the best. HD Foam.